At 3:17 p.m. local time in the southern Caribbean Sea, the ocean looked almost unreal. The surface was calm, smooth as glass, stretching cleanly toward the horizon. Visibility was perfect. There were no storms nearby, no heavy civilian traffic, and no obvious reason for concern, at least not at first glance. In the middle of the operating area, a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier continued on a steady course through international waters under routine transit conditions. Flight operations had been paused. Escort vessels were positioned in a standard protective formation. From the outside, everything about the group suggested control, routine, and normal movement. Then the radar picture changed. Inside the carrier's operations center, a surface search display refreshed, and 5 new contacts came into sharper focus. Venezuelan naval vessels. On their own, none of them appeared especially unusual. Together, they told a different story. Within seconds of each other, all 5 vessels adjusted course. Each one turned toward the carrier. There was no radio call before the maneuver, no active AIS signal, no clear navigational reason visible on the plot. To trained operators, the pattern was impossible to ignore. This did not look random. It looked coordinated. The contacts were logged immediately. Range, bearing, speed, every detail recorded down to the second. The vessels were still outside a clearly unsafe distance, but their movement said more than their location. They were not simply passing. They were closing in. They were not just observing. They were converging. On the bridge, the officer of the deck watched the same data appear across multiple systems. No one shouted. No alarms filled the space. The response remained calm, precise, and disciplined. This was the U.S. Navy operating exactly as it was designed to operate. Steady, controlled, and deliberate. The carrier did not change course. Under the rules of engagement, there had not yet been a direct, unsafe action. No visible defensive posture was raised. No precision tracking system shifted into an escalated mode. But intent at sea is not measured only by visible equipment. In naval operations, geometry matters, and the geometry was changing quickly. The 5 Venezuelan vessels were now forming a loose arc off the carrier's forward sector. Not close enough to call it a full enclosure, but not wide enough to look like ordinary transit. It was a pressure formation, close enough to be noticed, distant enough to deny. Still, the U.S. Navy answered first with procedure, not force. A bridge-to-bridge message went out across open maritime frequencies. This is a United States Navy vessel operating in international waters. You are approaching on an unsafe vector. State your intentions. Silence. The message was repeated, first in English, then in Spanish. No reply. On radar, the 5 contacts continued to close. At that moment, the situation moved from unclear to deliberate. In professional naval terms, silence after a coordinated maneuver is not empty. It communicates choice, and choice carries responsibility. The carrier group raised its awareness level, not its posture. Electronic surveillance systems began logging emissions from the approaching vessels. Long-range optical sensors turned, stabilized, and locked onto high-resolution imagery. Every wake pattern, every heading adjustment, every short burst of radar energy was time-stamped and saved. Visually, nothing about the U.S. formation changed. No sudden turns, no visible speed changes, no dramatic signals from the deck. That restraint was intentional. An aircraft carrier is not just a ship. It is a floating command center connected to satellites, aircraft, submarines, and surface vessels far beyond the visible horizon. Any direct pressure against it is never just a local move. It becomes a strategic message. The Venezuelan vessels were now close enough for individual hull features to be identified. Older platforms, limited air defense capability, light surface systems, no realistic way to directly challenge a carrier. Which raised the real question. If they could not truly confront it, why were they there? The answer was not about strength, it was about friction. For Caracas, making a U.S. carrier react even slightly could be enough to project resolve. For Washington, reacting the wrong way could create escalation, headlines, and consequences far beyond the Caribbean. So the carrier held its course. At 3:24 p.m., the closest point of approach was recalculated. The window was narrowing. The geometry was no longer theoretical. This was no longer a routine transit. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels had made their move, and the U.S. Navy was preparing to answer without a single visible escalation. At 3:25 p.m., the distance continued to shrink. On the surface, nothing looked dramatic. No sirens, no warning signals, no jets roaring overhead. To an untrained observer, it might have looked like 5 smaller vessels, simply moving across open water. But inside the carrier group, every second mattered. The nearest Venezuelan vessel had now moved inside 12 nautical miles. That number mattered, not because it crossed a legal line, but because it crossed a tactical one. At that range, assumptions become dangerous. Reaction time gets shorter. Intent begins to carry consequences. Another bridge-to-bridge message went out. This is a United States Navy vessel. You are maneuvering toward a U.S. carrier operating lawfully in international waters. Acknowledge. Again, silence. No delayed answer. No explanation. No correction. Just 5 hulls, 5 wakes, and 5 deliberate courses that continued to hold. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere stayed controlled, but the focus became sharper. The watch team updated the closest point of approach in real time. Bearings were called out calmly, almost clinically, as if this were a routine training scenario. But this was not training. By now, the pattern was clear enough to remove any reasonable doubt. The Venezuelan vessels were not simply passing by the carrier. They were not moving alongside it at a safe distance. Their formation was tightening in a subtle way, pressing inward just enough to make their presence impossible to ignore while still avoiding a step that would force an immediate response. It was pressure in the gray zone. For the U.S. Navy, this was one of the most difficult kinds of encounters. Not the kind that turns instantly into open danger, but the kind designed to test discipline. The kind that invites a mistake. On the bridge, the captain listened carefully. He did not interrupt. He did not rush. Every piece of information was measured against rules written for exactly this kind of moment. The carrier held course. That decision mattered more than it appeared to from the outside. A change in speed or direction could be interpreted immediately. Any adjustment, even a cautious one, could be presented as a reaction. And in situations like this, even defensive reactions can be used for political messaging. So the strike group did what it does best. It stayed steady. Electronic monitoring teams tracked signals coming from the Venezuelan vessels. Low-power surface search radar activity was detected. It was not an immediate danger signal, but it confirmed something important. The vessels were actively monitoring the carrier's movement. Long-range optical systems sent live imagery to multiple screens, capturing hull numbers, deck activity, and crew positioning. Every detail mattered. Every movement was recorded. Every small adjustment became part of the larger picture. At 3:29 p.m., the closest Venezuelan vessel changed course again by only a few degrees. It was subtle, almost carefully measured, but it reduced the closest point of approach even further. That was the moment the situation became more serious. Inside the operations center, a quiet understanding passed between watch officers. No one needed to say it directly. The carrier group could not allow the geometry to tighten much more without making its position clear. But control did not mean escalation. It meant clarity. The next step came not from the carrier's course, but from above the water. Flight operations were approved. A Seahawk helicopter was brought to readiness, not for direct action, but for surveillance, identification, and visible presence. Its purpose was simple: get a closer look without forcing the ships themselves any closer. As the helicopter lifted from the deck, the carrier made no dramatic move. There was no sudden change in posture, no visible shift meant to provoke. But the message was unmistakable. This was no longer only an encounter between vessels. Now there was a witness in the air. From above, the picture became clearer almost immediately. The Seahawk's sensors picked up details that could not be seen from the carrier's deck: crew movement, bridge activity, deck layout, and the position of mounted systems. The helicopter stayed low and offset, careful not to provoke, careful not to fly directly overhead. It applied pressure without creating a threat. The Venezuelan vessels noticed. Deck crews became more active. Personnel gathered near the bridge areas. One vessel slightly reduced speed, its wake shortening almost too subtly to notice. Another maintained its heading, but stopped closing the distance. The shape of the encounter had changed. Still, no radio response came, and in that moment, the silence carried more weight than words. In modern naval encounters, communication is not just a formality. It is a way to lower tension, clarify intent, and prevent mistakes. Choosing not to answer while continuing a coordinated approach is not passive. It is a decision, and that decision placed responsibility on the side that remained silent. By now, the carrier strike group had everything it needed. The intent had been documented. The behavior had been recorded. The options remained open. The U.S. Navy had not changed course, had not issued dramatic threats, and had not allowed itself to be pulled into a visible reaction. But the pressure had now quietly turned back on the approaching vessels. 5 Venezuelan naval ships were facing a carrier group that had not moved an inch, yet had steadily taken control of the entire encounter. And the decisive moment was coming fast. At 3:32 p.m., the balance shifted. From the carrier's bridge, almost nothing appeared different. Course steady, speed unchanged. The massive ship continued through the calm Caribbean water as if the 5 Venezuelan vessels were not there at all. But beneath that calm surface, the encounter had entered a new phase. Above the water, the Seahawk helicopter settled into a stable orbit off the starboard side of the nearest Venezuelan ship. its sensors began sending continuous video and telemetry back to the carrier and the escort vessels around it. What had started as radar tracks and calculated vectors had now become clear visual evidence. Every maneuver was visible. Every hesitation was recorded. Every adjustment became part of the official picture. The helicopter crew stayed disciplined. No sharp movements, no direct overflight, no sudden descent, just controlled presence. Calm, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Then came a measured transmission. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy helicopter operating in international waters. Your movements are being recorded. Maintain safe distance. The message was repeated in Spanish. For the first time since the encounter began, something changed. The lead Venezuelan ship reduced speed by 2 knots. It was subtle, but clear. Its bow waves softened. The tight geometry that had been pressing inward began to open. Seconds later, another ship followed. It was not a withdrawal. Not yet. But the coordinated pressure that had shaped the approach was beginning to break. Inside the carrier's operations center, no one celebrated. The watch team simply updated the plot. Bearings widened. The closest point of approach increased little by little. The data told the story before anyone had to say it. The Venezuelan formation was losing cohesion. This is the kind of moment where many tense encounters are decided. Pride can push one side to continue. A small miscalculation can undo restraint on both sides, but the U.S. Navy did not push. The Seahawk held its orbit. Sensors remained fixed. The carrier held course. The formation stayed disciplined. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was exactly the point. By refusing to react emotionally or visibly, the carrier strike group denied Venezuela the very thing pressure tactics are meant to create. A reaction that can be shown, edited, repeated, and turned into a message. There would be no sharp turn to broadcast. No heated radio exchange to use later. No dramatic warning signal to frame as provocation, only evidence. At 3:36 p.m., the third Venezuelan ship altered course, only 5 degrees to port. It was enough to break alignment with the carrier's path, but not so much that it looked like defeat. Moments later, the fourth ship followed. The final vessel remained the longest. It held speed and heading as if waiting for an order or perhaps a signal that never came. The Seahawk moved slightly closer, still outside any unsafe range. Its cameras focused on the bridge area of the remaining ship. A brief visual marker flashed across the scene, not as a threat, but as a signal. You are seen. You are being recorded. You are being. You are responsible for what happens next. That was the message. Finally, the last Venezuelan ship reduced speed. The formation dissolved. No announcement was made. No acknowledgement came over the radio. The Venezuelan ships did not make a dramatic turn or rush away from the area. Instead, they separated one by one, taking independent headings that led them away from the carrier's track. For Caracas, it was the cleanest exit available. For the U.S. Navy, it was the outcome they wanted. Control restored without a single visible escalation. By 3:41 p.m., the nearest contact was steadily increasing distance. The carrier strike group remained intact, steady, and unaltered. The Seahawk completed one final orbit, then turned back toward the carrier. Its mission was complete. The encounter was over, but its meaning remained. 5 naval vessels had tried to apply pressure on a U.S. aircraft carrier in international waters. They had done it silently, deliberately, and in coordination. And they stepped away not because of force, but because they were outmatched in discipline, documentation, and control. In modern naval confrontations, success is not always marked by dramatic scenes on the horizon. Sometimes it is measured by what never happens. No open clash, no damaged ships, no panicked headlines, no moment that could spiral beyond control. Just a clear message delivered through restraint. The carrier continued on its course, steady as ever, and behind it the Caribbean returned to silence. By 3:45 p.m., the encounter had fully cooled down. The 5 Venezuelan naval vessels were now spread out across miles of open water, each one moving on a separate heading that no longer crossed the path of the carrier strike group. On radar, their tracks no longer looked like converging lines. They had returned to being ordinary surface contacts, no longer a direct tactical concern. Aboard the U.S. carrier, almost nothing changed. Flight operations remained paused. Escort vessels held their formation. The strike group continued its transit exactly as planned, as if the entire encounter had never happened. But that calm continuity was not accidental. It was the final and perhaps most important message of the entire episode. In naval strategy, what happens after a tense moment can matter just as much as what happens during it. A dramatic reaction can give the other side a story. A steady course can take that story away. Inside the operations center, the focus shifted from live monitoring to analysis. Every second of the encounter had already been preserved. Radar plots, infrared video, radio logs, signal activity, and position data were all stored in a complete timeline. And that timeline told a very clear story. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels maneuvered in coordination toward a U.S. aircraft carrier operating in international waters. They did so without answering radio calls. They continued to close the distance despite repeated attempts to communicate. Only after U.S. surveillance assets made their actions clearly visible did the formation begin to break apart. There was no need for speculation. The record spoke for itself. For Washington, that record mattered far beyond the Caribbean. In situations like this, the contest is not only about ships and distance. It is also about the narrative that follows. Any claim that the carrier group had acted irresponsibly would now have to face a full timeline, showing restraint, professionalism, and careful adherence to international norms. For Caracas, the calculation was more complicated. The objective was never a direct challenge. Venezuela's Navy did not have the realistic capability to pressure a carrier strike group on equal terms. The goal appeared to be something different. Friction. A moment, a reaction. An image or exchange that could later be framed as resistance at home or as overreach by the United States abroad. But that objective did not succeed. There were no dramatic visuals of an American carrier turning away, no heated radio exchange to replay, no sudden signal that could be reinterpreted as escalation. What remained instead was silence, distance, and a quiet disengagement that said more than any broadcast could. Strategically, the outcome favored the side that never raised its voice. The U.S. Navy demonstrated something more valuable than raw strength. Control. Control of space. Control of tempo. Control of the narrative. That is the core of modern naval deterrence. Power is not measured only by size, range, or technology. It is also measured by the ability to absorb pressure without reacting impulsively, to let the other side reveal intent, and then to respond in a way that leaves little room for distortion. That is exactly what happened in the days that followed. No major public escalation followed the incident. No dramatic statement turned the encounter into a wider crisis. The moment passed without dominating headlines precisely because it had been handled in a way that denied drama. But make no mistake, inside defense and diplomatic circles, it was noticed. Every Navy operating in contested waters studies encounters like this. They do not look only at who stepped back, they look at how it happened, why it happened, and what message remained afterward. And the lesson from this episode was clear. You can approach a U.S. carrier, you can try to create pressure, but you cannot force it to respond on your terms. The carrier did not need to maneuver dramatically, it did not need to raise the temperature, it did not need to display force. Its advantage was patience, documentation, and discipline. For the sailors involved, the encounter would likely become just another entry in the ship's log. A professional response to a professional challenge. No celebration, no public spectacle, no need for exaggeration, that too was part of the message. The strike group continued forward, leaving behind a calm stretch of sea and 5 vessels that had learned exactly where the limits were. In the modern maritime world, restraint is not weakness, it is leverage. And on that afternoon in the Caribbean, leverage, not force, decided the outcome. Long after the 5 Venezuelan vessels had faded into distant radar contacts, the meaning of the encounter continued to ripple outward. At sea, the incident was over. Strategically, it had only just begun. Encounters like this often pass without public attention because nothing visibly dramatic happens. No major collision, no open clash, no scene that instantly fills the news cycle. To the casual observer, it may look like nothing happened at all. But to defense planners, naval analysts, and allied fleets watching quietly from a distance, everything happened. This was a textbook example of modern naval signaling. Venezuela tested the boundary. The United States defined it without crossing it. That distinction matters. In today's maritime environment, open confrontation is usually the least useful outcome for everyone involved. Instead, nations often operate in what strategists call the gray zone. Spaces where pressure is applied without open escalation, where intent is suggested rather than declared, and where discipline matters as much as capability. That is exactly what unfolded in the Caribbean. Caracas attempted to create tactical friction. 5 vessels, coordinated movement, deliberate silence. The goal was not to directly challenge the carrier group. The goal was to force attention, create uncertainty, and push the U.S. formation into a visible response that could be framed, debated, and amplified. But the response never came on those terms. Instead, the carrier group stayed steady, recorded everything, and allowed the facts to build the message. By the time the Venezuelan vessels separated, the outcome had already been decided. Not by speed, not by noise, not by dramatic action, but by patience, discipline, and control. What they encountered instead was strategic denial. The U.S. Navy refused to give them the reaction they were looking for. No sudden maneuvers, no dramatic warnings, no visible escalation that could be turned into a political message. Instead, the carrier strike group stayed steady and allowed the Venezuelan vessels to reveal the situation themselves. Through geometry, through silence, through intent that became impossible to ignore once it was documented. That was not passivity. That was discipline. And discipline has a way of spreading beyond the moment itself. Navies around the world study encounters like this carefully because they help establish precedent. They answer an unspoken question shared by every commander operating near a more powerful force. How far can you push before the response changes? On that afternoon, the answer was delivered clearly. You can approach, you can posture, you can test the boundary. But if you rely on ambiguity and silence, you do not control the outcome. The side that controls the tempo and the record controls the encounter. For the United States, this reinforced a broader strategy visible across global waterways. Whether in the Caribbean, the South China Sea, or the Red Sea, the emphasis remains the same. Maintain presence, uphold international law, and deny rivals the emotional reaction they may be trying to provoke. It is a strategy built on confidence. Confidence that does not require constant displays of force. Confidence that trusts procedure over impulse. Confidence that understands every radar contact, every course adjustment, and every unanswered call can become part of a much larger conversation. For Venezuela, the lesson was just as clear. Pressure without matching capability has limits. Symbolic moves can lose their power when met with patience. Silence, once documented, can become a liability instead of leverage. The 5 vessels returned to routine movement. The carrier continued its transit. Officially, nothing more needed to be said. But inside command centers and planning rooms, the encounter became data. A case study, another example of how modern naval power is often exercised not through confrontation, but through control. And that brings us to the real question. In a world where naval forces increasingly meet without direct conflict, where some of the most important moments happen quietly on radar screens and sensor feeds, what does strength actually look like? Is it a louder response? Or is it restraint backed by undeniable capability? Should the United States respond more forcefully to encounters like this? Or is holding the line without overreacting still the smarter tool? That question does not have an easy answer. And it should not. Because the most dangerous moments at sea are not always the ones that look dramatic from the outside. They are the quiet moments when someone decides just once to abandon discipline. On that day in the Caribbean, no one did. And because of that, the sea remained calm. For now. Let us know what you think. Would you have handled the encounter differently, or was this the right balance of power and restraint? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-world naval encounters explained with clarity and precision, make sure you are subscribed. If you want to support this channel directly, consider joining the fleet. Because out on the open ocean, the most important confrontations are often the ones that never fully unfold.